This podcast and Iowa Public Radio are listener supported. If you love listening to this podcast, consider joining the thousands of supporters who help keep it going. Donate now at ipr.org/donate.
This is Garden Variety, a horticulture podcast from Iowa Public Radio and Iowa State University Extension and Outreach. I'm Charity Nebbe. Planting pollinator gardens and bee-friendly lawns is a popular trend. It is also a trend that can really make a difference for Iowa's pollinators and the people who depend on them. And by the way, all of us are people who depend on them. Here to talk about our native pollinators, even some of the less popular ones, and what we can do to support them is Amy Toth, professor of ecology, evolutional, and organismal biology at Iowa State University. Hello, Amy.
Hello, Charity.
It's wonderful to have you here. And let's start with the importance of pollinators. I think this is something we have heard more and more about in recent years, but I also think it's something that bears repeating. I mean, pollinators support life on Earth, right?
Absolutely. So, yeah, I'm so happy to be here to talk about pollinators. And springtime is a wonderful time to be thinking about them as they emerge from their overwintering. And so, yes, pollinators are extremely important for us humans, of course, because they pollinate many of the foods that we love, as well as a lot of the things that we like on top of our foods, like oil, also things like coffee, chocolate. So some of the luxury items that we feel like maybe we can't live without, thank a pollinator for all of those things. And a vast majority of the fruit and vegetable crops also. So thinking about your diet diversity. So if you want a healthy diet with lots of color, lots of variety, then we really need pollinators for that. So it's estimated that every third bite of food is the result of insect pollination. And so that's just sort of the food systems, but then they're also of economic value. And so it's estimated that between $250 and $500 billion of crop pollination services are conducted by insect pollinators. And then not to mention their ecosystem roles.
Right. And I want to talk about like diversity of pollinators because, you know, we had our big Save the Bees campaigns and we all love butterflies, but there are a lot of different kinds of pollinators. And of course, honeybees aren't even native to Iowa. So let's talk about how many different kinds of pollinators are there that are native to the state?
Yeah, it might surprise you. So, in fact, the group that contains bees, wasps, and ants is probably arguably one of the most diverse groups of animals on the planet. And so if we're just thinking about number of species, it's kind of mind-boggling, and a lot of them probably aren't even named. But in terms of some of the ones that you're more likely to notice just walking around your garden, obviously there are butterflies. And so there are about 119 species of butterflies in Iowa. And then bee species, we actually don't have a count, an exact count, but we think it's around 300 species. And in fact, that's something a group of us are working on in Iowa right now, is getting an official state list for the bees. But then, of course, there are other pollinators too. So we have obviously moths, but a lot of other insects, including beetles, flies, ants. And then one of my personal favorites are the wasps. And so wasps are some of the closest relatives to bees and are doing a ton of pollination, but they tend to be underappreciated because, let's face it, people are scared of them.
Yes.
Because of their stingers. However, they're actually very, very beneficial in your garden, removing garden pests as well as pollinating. And they're also extremely important in their roles in ecosystems.
So you mentioned maybe around 300 different species of native bees in Iowa. I can imagine that there may be some species that have already gone extinct in the state. Pollinators are really struggling in a lot of places, particularly in the Midwest. Why is the Midwest such a hard place for pollinators these days?
Yeah, the Midwest has kind of the dubious distinction of being one of the worst places to be a bee. In my opinion, in the U.S. So it's a combination of, we have a very harsh climate and highly variable. It can be too hot sometimes, too cold sometimes. We get floods. We have a lot of sort of bad weather patterns that can really affect the tiny things in the world, like the insects. But then also because of habitat loss and the conversion of Iowa's prairies and forests into sort of monocultures of corn and soybean, this has led to massive changes in the landscape for pollinators. And so in the past, they would have been flying over fields full of just a huge diversity of different flowers that they could forage on. And now we're reduced to a lot less diversity and a lot less cover of those plants on the landscape. In addition, there is also pesticide use, both in sort of urban spaces as well as obviously in agricultural fields. And so a lot of those pesticides can have sort of off-target effects on beneficial insects like pollinators. And so put all of those things together, and you kind of have the perfect storm for pollinator declines. And so indeed, we see pretty stark losses of pollinators if we look at just the number of species declining. We don't have great data for a lot of the species. As I mentioned, there's a ton of diversity. But just one example is the bumblebees. Because they're large and charismatic and relatively easy to notice and identify, we have slightly better data on them. And at least a quarter of our bumblebee species are declining here in the Midwest, and some estimates up to 50% of those species.
And we do have officially endangered species of bee as well, right?
That's right. So something that I find exciting about Iowa as a place to observe and study bees is that we actually are home to an endangered species of bee, the rusty patch bumblebee, Bombus affinis. And so this is a bumblebee species that is native to North America and historically covered a large part of the eastern and northern part of North America and into Canada. But in the past few decades, the populations of this bee have declined hugely. So they're at like 80% reduction in their populations. And a lot of states where they occurred historically, they no longer are found. Iowa, however, is a place where they're just holding on. And so you can actually still find rusty patch bumblebees in Iowa. They're quite rare. And if you see one, it's kind of a special day because it's not something that you're going to see every day.
So there are things that we as individuals can do to actually support pollinator populations. Again, even the wasps that we may not like and want, we can do things to keep those populations stronger and maybe even help them regrow. So let's talk about the basics. I mean, before we really talk about what we can plant, what are some of the basic things that we should think about to support pollinators?
Yeah, I think the sort of good news is that there are things that each and every one of us can do that can make our little corner of the world more hospitable to pollinators. And so I guess I'll quickly summarize, there's multiple things, but first you can reduce the use of herbicides and insecticides. Another is providing shelter for them in your yard or in the place that you live, in your farm, for example. We'll talk about plants, but obviously planting flowers that will provide food for pollinators. And then finally, we're also in an exciting time where you can go out and take pictures and you can observe, and you might even see an endangered species like the rusty patch bumblebee right in your backyard. And so you can actually document the occurrence of these species, and there are actually large numbers of scientific studies and researchers that are using those data to help inform population trends and try to understand where some of the most threatened pollinators are occurring in the state and also across the United States.
And there are, as you mentioned, there are opportunities for citizen scientists to really contribute to the knowledge of some of these species. Even before planting, though, we can also help by not doing some of the things that people tend to like to do as far as creating shelter or leaving shelter for pollinators. Tell me about that.
Yeah, that's right. And so maybe humans don't necessarily like a messy yard, but pollinators do. And so one of the things that may be a little bit against the tradition is to not mow your leaves or to not rake your leaves. We can talk about mowing too in a second, but not raking your leaves. And so those leaves are actually amazing habitat for multiple different types of pollinators, especially during their overwintering period. And so that includes caterpillars, the pupae of various caterpillar butterflies and moths, as well as things like bumblebees can use that for shelter in the wintertime. And so maybe, one approach is mow your front yard, rake your front yard, but maybe leave parts of your backyard unraked, and that could provide really valuable habitat for some of those pollinators during the hard times of winter.
More people are mowing to mulch, mowing those leaves to mulch them up. Does that still work as shelter for pollinators?
Yeah, it's better than
Raking.
raking every possible leaf, but those large piles of leaves, in fact, so even just leaving a pile maybe would be a nice alternative, because some of those deep piles of leaves really are, that's where the shelter occurs. And as it decomposes, it generates heat. And that actually is really valuable for some of the pollinators in not freezing to death over the winter. So really having a little bit of leaf litter is really important.
So a lot of us do like to plant flowers for pollinators. Planting native makes a real difference, right?
Yeah. And so native plants have multiple advantages. And so one is just the fact that if you choose a variety of species that bloom across the entire growing season, that's going to support a large number of pollinator species. A lot of them have relatively narrow activity periods. And so if you can plant some that will be, spring, summer into fall, then that's going to help support a larger number of species. So that's one important thing about native plants. Another also is that some of the bees, for example, they forage only on specific native plants. They have this tight relationship that is the result of millions of years of evolution, where they forage on particular plants. And if those plants are not there, they simply cannot live. That's also true of butterflies and moths in many cases, where they have specific host plants where they need to lay their eggs, and then their caterpillars will eat those plants, only those plants specifically, as they're growing. And so those native plants are really important for supporting native pollinators.
We only have 30 seconds right now, but we can also rethink our lawns. Grassy lawns, Kentucky bluegrass, that doesn't do a lot for pollinators.
Yes. And so maybe we can talk more about this, but mowing less, and then also seeding your lawn with certain flowering species, having a flowering lawn, or maybe having less lawn and helping share that space with some native plants in part of your yard.
Amy Toth is a professor of ecology, evolutional, and organismal biology at Iowa State University. For more gardening information and tips, please subscribe to our Garden Variety newsletter. You can find out more at iowapublicradio.org/garden. I'm Charity Nebbe.
Curious what's happening here in Iowa? Wondering what's going on in the rest of the world? Feed your curiosity with IPR, where every day you can expect to hear something unexpected. Iowa Public Radio. News, music, and culture for the curious.
Garden Variety is a production of Iowa Public Radio and Iowa State University Extension. It's produced by me, Erin Stile, Caitlin Troutman, and the Iowa Public Radio talk show team. For more garden goodness, please subscribe to our Garden Variety newsletter. Just go to iowapublicradio.org/garden. I'm Charity Nebbe. See you next time.